We had the opportunity to be here in the home of Reverend C. Herbert Oliver, one of the, oh wow, one of the architects of the Birmingham, Alabama, stay out of downtown shopping for black folk. In fact, it
What
was
year was
Reverend
that?
Oliver who called for,
What year was it?
1962.
Oh, wow.
it was Reverend Oliver who asked black people to stay out of downtown Birmingham shopping. So it's my great pleasure to be here in his home, and we have Dr. Isa Isa. Pronounce that, Dr. Isa.
Issa, that's fine.
Isa. And so it gives me great pleasure for these two historians and activists to talk to one another. The question that I had asked the other brother, Dr. Issa, was did the civil rights movement, did integration affect, how did it affect, was it negative or positive integration on the black community, the black movement, the African-centered movement? How did it affect African Americans, integration?
Right. I mean, it was horrific. We have a whole. I'll put it like this: in 1960, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his last speech in the United States, he did it from Johnson C. Smith University in North Carolina. It's called "Whither, Why, or Now," and basically he prophesied 40 years to the year 2000 what integration would do to black people and what the current civil rights leadership was doing at that time, that they were driving black people into extinction. I write about this in my last article on how black colleges are turning white, the ethnic cleansing of HBCUs in the age of Obama. That's the title. And I start off with this long quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. He said, by the year 2000, there will be less and less black school teachers, black people, or fewer and fewer black kids will want to go to college. They will want nothing to do with Africa and would identify more with their Native American blood than with their Native American blood than with their African blood, and they will lose contact with the rising African world. Up until then, our struggle had always been with Africa. And Du Bois said this before he left. The problems of integration. He prophesied, and it's a very long but very important article because he's looking into the future, being a futuristic intellectual. So now we see that everything that he prophesied about is come to fruition. Our struggle, particularly that was waged with people like Reverend Oliver, the sacrifices that were made, the deaths, to make sure that a group is advanced. Many of those struggles and those treaties that we signed, as we call them, bills and amendments and all of these things, but they were treaties, really, a treaty to end the war that was waged because it cost the federal government billions of dollars. The struggle that we waged, and they didn't feel it was worth it. So they said, okay, if all they want to do is be included, we will let them in for a period of time. But we must take the souls and spirits of their minds and their youth. And that's what they did for 30 years until hip-hop came. And that's how I came into my consciousness, through hip-hop. That's how I learned about Africa and our struggle and our history through groups like Public Enemy. Then those generations that came after me, they had nothing, and we see them with the Black Lives Matter, and there's other genders are put in front of them, particularly that of the gay and lesbian gender. That comes first, and that is the driving point of the Black Lives Matter movement. So yes, integration has destroyed us. And I don't know, without the divine providence of God stepping in, the next 20 years, as it regards our 400-year sojourn in this country, could be quite different. And that's why, yeah. So it has destroyed black people in our international movement. It has destroyed up until then. It was always international, with Africa at the center of it.
Reverend Oliver, what is your thinking on integration, its effect on the black movement?
Well, I'd have to go back to 1948 when I first got involved and was put in jail for allowing Negroes and white people to sit together in a church without signs saying Negroes and whites and separating the races. And that was in 1948. And we were opposed to segregation. And there were, it was just everywhere in Birmingham. Segregation was the way of life in Birmingham. You had Negro and white separate restrooms, eating places. There was white water and there was Negro water. And everything was totally separated, and that's the atmosphere in which I grew up. And I was very much opposed to it. And there was a minister there in Birmingham who, well, I say in Birmingham, but he was in Ensley, Reverend Lee, who was very successful in getting Negroes to register and vote. And he was supposedly in the white neighborhood being a peeping Tom, and he was shot by the police. And the black community knew that this was not so. I learned that he had raised a family of 13. He was 63 years old, a man highly respected in the Negro community. And I went to the funeral home where his body was and stood over him and said that if something is not done about this, then one day you'll be lying here and that will be the end of you. And so I did not know that that was in January 1948, and I didn't know that this meeting was coming up to be held in May of 1948, an integrated group that was coming to Birmingham. And Bull Connor had vowed that they would obey segregation or they would not come. And so I saw and followed the events, and I had decided that if there was something I could do, I would. This group was scheduled to meet with the 16th Street Baptist Church. That was only 1 block away from the church that I was serving at that time. And the minister there, Reverend Luke Beard, under Connor's threats, canceled the meeting a day or two before they were to be held. And the leader of the group made contact with a Negro minister in the south side of Birmingham, and he agreed, but in about a half an hour he too had been contacted by Bull Connor and he declined. So then I went to the group. I knew him personally, Louis Burnham, and told him that I'm serving a small church here. If you would like to meet here, you're very welcome. And he accepted. So he did not put it on the phone where we were meeting. He just put the address down, and people came and took her. He would give them a slip of paper, and with that they would come to the place where they could meet. So the meeting was held. The first session, it was a 2-day meeting. The first session was over before the police found out. But they found out in the afternoon, and they came and read to us the segregation code of Birmingham and said that we were violating the law and that we should disperse. And we did not disperse. And that's when James Dombrowski, Doris Sink, and Eddie Forey were arrested and taken to jail. And they came back and asked who was in charge of the property. I told them I was. So they said, "We are arresting you too." So they arrested me. And I was taken to jail and fingerprinted. I called Attorney Shores, and he came and got me out within a couple of hours. Then we went back to the church and cut down the weeds and made a path to the back entrance of the church. And we decided that if they got to have segregation, they'd have to go to the back entrance. So that became the white entrance. The back of the church where the weeds cut down, that was the white entrance. And Negroes, or black people, could come into the front door. Now, Bull Connor enforced this because the law itself did not say that white people have to come at the front. They left that out. So he was free to force white people to go to the back, which was really not good segregation. But that's what he did. And the next day, Senator Glenn Taylor was to be the featured speaker in the morning, which was a Sunday morning. And he came to the church not knowing what had happened. And when he attempted to go into the front door of the church, he was told that he had to go around the back and come into the back entrance. And he didn't understand that, so he proceeded to go in, but an officer was standing with his arm over the door. And an officer standing on the ground, which was there was a step, 6 or 7 steps up to the entrance. And there was a policeman on the ground there, and he grabbed the senator by his arm and flung him off of the porch and sent him spinning over a barbed wire fence and blooded his shin. And they scooped him up and took him to jail. That's how he got arrested. Well, that made news. Paul Robeson commented about that when he was getting ready to make a trip. It hit national and international news. So that's my introduction to the struggle against segregation. I don't know that I was so much for integration, but I just wanted segregation out of the way. And we could make our choice as to who we wanted to be with. But that's how I got involved, and I did not know at the time. There were no other groups, there were no civil rights groups, there were no activists involved. And I felt that having been arrested, I would never be called to serve a church. And I think I was right. But I didn't know that God had some people around the corner, we might say. 6 years later, when Dr. King was arrested and jailed and led so many people to the jails in Montgomery, and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who founded the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, challenged segregation and was beaten and jailed for it many times. Within a few years, not less than 6 years, then the walls of segregation began to crumble, and they eventually crumbled under the powerful leadership of Dr. King and Reverend Shuttlesworth. So now, having been arrested, it means now that it's an honor to have been arrested in those days. So it was not against me to have been jailed. In 1965, I got a call to come to Brooklyn to serve a Presbyterian church, and I came, and that's when I left Birmingham. So that's how I got involved. But we were not then thinking about the effect that
Integration.
integration would have on the black community. But we knew that there were black businesses that were booming. We I knew a young man there in the neighborhood where I lived who had a meat market and a grocery store, and he just made money hand over hand and hand over foot during that whole time, because black people came to him and bought from him. But those stores, I do have a clipping, not on my hand right now, but in January 1963, Dun & Bradstreet put out a statement which said that during 1962, more than 500 businesses in Birmingham had closed.
Why?
Why? Because people were not shopping downtown. It was in 1962 that it began. It was on August the 2nd that the announcement was made in the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights for Negroes to stay out of downtown Birmingham. They didn't say boycott, they just said stay out of downtown Birmingham, and that was not against the law. So we did not use the term boycott, but Negroes began to stay out of downtown Birmingham, and I would go every day at the peak of the shopping hour and count all the Negroes in downtown stores in Birmingham, in Pizzett's, Loveman's, Crest, Woolworth, and Newberry's. Those were the main places, the 5 and 10 stores where Negroes went. Loveman's, of course, was not a 5 and 10. Loveman's was the equivalent of a Bloomingdale's now here, and Macy's was the equivalent of Pizzett's in Birmingham. So I would go around every day and count the Negroes who were shopping in those stores on the first floor, and come back to the movement each Monday night and report my count. And when we started, there were thousands of Negroes all over those stores shopping and spending. I would come back to Monday night and report it to the mass meeting. And by April 19th, I didn't realize that it had been so effective that the Birmingham News came out with an article headlined, "Don't Blackjack Birmingham," and a letter from the editor saying that Negroes were doing the wrong thing. It was going to hurt Negroes more than anybody else. I wrote back on the 19th and told the editor that I did not think so, and that we had tried everything to bring about better human relations, but we were not able to, so we're simply staying out of the stores until things get better. So that's how that began. The Miles College students, under the leadership of Dr. Pitts, joined the movement and helped to get the word out and picket in downtown and try to urge Negroes to stay out of downtown, period. It was no law. It was not breaking the law to stay out of downtown Birmingham. So they couldn't charge us with violating the boycott law. So that continued. When Dr. King came, it was the following year. It was in the spring of 1963. And the boycott had already been effective for a year. So, but it was more effective when Dr. King came and led people to the jails and in protests and demonstrations. And Bull Connor responded with fire hoses and dogs. Mm-hmm. And that's where you get all the pictures of Bull Connor doing everything he could to stay the fight against segregation. He did only what he knew how to do, and he did not know how to handle the situation, and all he could do was bring force. And that played right into the hands of those who were struggling against segregation. Now, afterwards, I did discover some years later that those black businesses that were in Birmingham basically went out of business. And as I look back, I say, wow, that we did not intend, but that was the result of our fighting against segregation with all our might. It really did away with those who were able within that segregated system to form businesses and prosper. But that was not the uppermost element or thought in our minds. Now, what you say about Du Bois, I did not. I was not had no contact with Du Bois. Never met him. But I do know that he opposed Marcus Garvey with all of his might, and I don't know. I haven't studied to find out what was his rationale. But what he has predicted was quite true, that the segregation mind was not broken by our struggle. It's still here, and it is very, very strong. The separate mentality still governs this country. And my efforts to find out why led me to reading the Constitution several times, and I did read it at least for 40 times to try to find out what is happening now from this Constitution. And I found out that this Constitution that we have, the Constitution of 1787, does not define citizenship. It uses the word citizen over and over again, but it doesn't define who a citizen is. So when I look on the computer to find out when George Washington became a citizen, I couldn't find it. It's not there. When did the Thomas Jefferson and the leaders of the Revolutionary War against England, when did they become citizens? They never did. They never thought about it, but they used the words citizen and called themselves citizens and assumed that they were citizens. But they were not, because there's no constitutional definition of citizen. And we are just left out of it altogether, except as slaves. And that the slaveholders were given extra representation in Congress by having people in slavery. So that's what I found out, and that has not changed. The Constitution has not changed. The 14th Amendment is supposed to have been a change of the Constitution for the better, but it was never ratified, and it was never pursued in the way that the Constitution says that you must follow in order to become a citizen. So we are still now not citizens. The 14th Amendment was never ratified. It was declared ratified by Congress, but it was never ratified with votes. So it's a fraud. And when Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney made his ruling, summed up in the words that a Negro has no rights that a white man is bound to respect, he's strictly constitutional, because the Constitution does not give Negroes any rights at all, and that has not changed. And the ruling of the Supreme Court remains there until it is superseded by another ruling or overruled by another ruling. And no ruling has yet, that is, no ruling of the Supreme Court has yet overruled the decision of Roger Taney in 1857.
Analysis, I know, is kind of different but it's based on my experience and my readings of our sojourn in this society. But I have a question for the great Reverend, and I'm honored to be here as a professionally trained historian and an archivist. I was reading a quote that you said that there's a difference between being African American and black, and being black is an experience. But you didn't define what being an African American is and what it means. And I would like to get some understanding, because I've been thinking about that. That's the first thing I wanted to ask you.
Okay. Well, African American is a term that black people did not choose. It seems to me that that was a term that Jesse Jackson preferred. And whites went along with Jesse Jackson and began calling us Afro-Americans or African Americans. There's a friend of mine, Avis Smith, who has written a book on that. He took Jackson to court and said that he had no right to put a name on people who had not themselves chosen. So then there are lots of other names, Negroes and blacks. Up until 1960, you couldn't use the term black in this community of people who grew out of slavery.
Why?
Black
It was too radical.
No. There was too much color prejudice.
Ah.
So when you call somebody black, that's a war. You fight and settle it wherever you are.
It's like calling somebody African.
Yeah. Well, no, not African. People never went to war nor fought if you call them African.
Ah.
But when I was growing up, if you called somebody black, that was almost like a curse word. So you just didn't do that. We spoke of colored people and light-skinned Negroes. But you didn't say black-skinned Negroes. No. It wasn't until the 60s when people became, after James Brown, saying I'm black and I'm proud, that began to take on, and we just gradually got to the point where we could use the term black with dignity.
Right.
And that took many years, many decades, but it began in the 60s with the black is beautiful. That civil rights leaders began to use that phrase, black is beautiful, until it got to the point now where it's an honor to be called black. And people of light skin color can speak of black people and not have to apologize or go to war, because that has been a basic change within the black community. Now back to your question. Dr. Issa, tell me again, give me your question again, because I think I've lost the essence of it.
You said black is an experience.
Oh yes, okay. This came to me many, many years ago because there are all kinds of shades within the black community now. There's from Adam Clayton Powell white to Marcus Garvey black. So I just thought about this for so long, and I said, well, now being black is not a matter of a color. It's an experience that you have regardless of your color. If you're as white as Adam Clayton Powell and black as Marcus Garvey, you're going to have an experience in America that is equivalent to being rejected and segregated against and discriminated against and cheated and killed. That's the experience that you will get. So it is not a color. It's an experience in this country that makes you black.
Right.
Because there are white people, or rather Negroes who are white, skinned, but Negroes. And they get the same treatment here. So I finally said that it's the experience that makes you Negro or black in America. And everyone who lives here and who has 1/32 of black blood in them, black blood, whatever that is, then you are Negro. You can call yourself an African, but they treat you like a Negro here, without respect, without dignity. So you have to say who you are and be who you are and go against the whole system of racism that this country lives on, that it created and lives on and thrives on to this very day. And they are very much worried about what you have said about where we came from and how we got out of where we were. We did not deny our African heritage. Of course, some have, but we didn't do that. But we realized that we were in a situation where that did not mean it. That was a detriment in America.
Right.
So we have to move to the point where it is no longer a detriment.
Yes.
And I just saw through Brother Clemson's enlightenment about the King Alfred plan.
Yes.
And the way he's talking is the same way that the people who are pushing the King Alfred plan say that black people or Negroes are thinking. And that kind of thinking must be destroyed according to the King Alfred plan.
Right.
And you are articulating it, which means you are marked for death in the King Alfred plan.
Yeah. And they tried to kill me.
Okay.
And I had a serious struggle over the last, can't find work, everything. They tried to kill me, for real.
Well, the Alfred plan is to kill off all blacks in the country and put them, just kill them all off, get it over with, because they are not going to stop agitating for what you're saying and what I'm saying.
Right.
So they are preparing for that. They said these people are not going to change, so they must be eliminated. So that's what the King Alfred plan is. Kill them all off. 22 million of us. And they stated it on TV. I mean, if you got that kind of plan, you don't announce it in public. But the first time I heard it from someone on the computer. And I hadn't known about it, but wow, I can see that they do not intend to allow to happen what you're saying and what I'm saying. They will kill us all off. So that's serious.
Reverend Oliver, let me ask you to describe the black community when you were coming up in terms of businesses, in terms of churches, in terms of leadership among black people, in terms of our cohesiveness or our togetherness, so that we can see before and after. Before segregation, who ran the schools? What was education like? What were the businesses in the black community like? Kind of give us a snapshot of the black community before integration and the black community today when you go to these communities.
Okay. We grew up as a cohesive society. Cohesive around separateness and segregation. And we understood that that was where the prevailing society wanted us to be, and if we wanted to be in good terms with them, we had to accept what they gave to us. So there were segregated schools. Whites went to separate schools, blacks went to separate schools. There was only one high school in Birmingham, Alabama, and that was Parker High. Parker High was started by A.H. Parker, who was a follower of Booker T. Washington. And he set up industrial high school, teaching Negroes trades, how to run printing presses, how to make clothes, how to mend shoes. All of the things that we need to enable us to live were taught at Parker High. And I took printing under Fess Watley. When A.H. Parker died, the school's name changed from Industrial High School to Parker High School. And that's where I went, that's where my son went. And but there was a cohesiveness, but it was a cohesiveness within the framework of segregation. You had to stay there and be happy there. That was all that the segregationists would allow. If you wanted to get out of that and break out of that, you didn't do that in the South, otherwise you were killed or lynched, or you'd have to leave. And there were hundreds of thousands of Negroes who had to leave the South because they simply could not stand the segregation there. But when they came north, there was a more subtle kind of segregation, which still did not accept them. So wherever we go in America, we are unaccepted and unacceptable. And there is no program in this country that provides for the type of dignity that you're speaking of. Sharing power? No. This country hasn't even accepted that they don't have all the power that they thought they had. And right now they feel that they control all black people, and everybody's got to fit in with their way of life, or else they want to wipe them out and kill them. That's the white mentality that's still ruling this country, and that's the mentality that has to go. If we can find a way to survive together, very good. But the King Alfred plan makes it very clear that they do not have any intention ever to share power. There's no such thing as sharing power with black people in this country or in any country. So that's the racism that is still so deep in this country that